If you don't know me, I'm Ted. I want to introduce Braden, our next respondent. Braden is a professor in the doctoral faculty here at the Graduate Theological Union. And as you heard earlier, he and Brian both got their PhDs here at the GTU. So that tells you that some students do graduate, and after they graduate, they do well. See, that's your future. Braden directs the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, and with Bob Russell, they recently wrote a successful grant proposal to the John Templeton Foundation to pursue a research grant on artificial intelligence and virtue called its Virtuous AI.
Yes.
Virtuous AI. This past Wednesday, just a couple days ago, Braden and I went down to Palo Alto to make a presentation on AI, and in the audience were a large number of software engineers and others who are actually in Silicon Valley companies, and they really appreciated the fact that theologians were taking their work seriously. And I think this is a period of time in which this particular topic is really going to be valuable, something the church can offer the wider public. So, Braden.
Well, thank everybody for being here, and thank you, Brian, for a very stimulating and provocative presentation. I'm surprised nobody's made that joke yet, but I look forward to the discussion. Given the breadth of your work, I risk becoming unorganized in how I'm responding because I want to go in a million directions. So I'll lay out a short roadmap here. My response is broken down into 3 sections. I'll start with some reflections on the term provocation itself. Then I'll discuss some of the aspects of dialectical analysis in conversation with virtue. And then finally, I'll look at some things on the intersection of loneliness and connection. So your section on electricity made me think about the word electric itself. The alternative definition is having or producing a sudden sense of thrilling excitement. I imagine there was definitely a time when, quote, allowing work and play to be done under artificial lights at night, end quote, was electric in this sense and a provocation. But on page 3, you say that a blackout now is just an annoyance on par with that of the bother you get from a mosquito. So I don't have the data to support this, but I have a hunch that for those who are surrounded by lights at night on a regular basis, a clear night sky without light pollution, allowing people to see stars and the Milky Way, could be far more provoking than the changing lights and signs in Times Square. The first question I will ask then is perhaps the least interesting, because I think there's an easy response. Is technology as a whole a provocation, or only certain kinds and forms of technology provocations? I think Ted has already started us around that conversation. You say that provocation causes us to react or to respond, but it is possible that the kind of response elicited could be that of avoidance. I'm curious what it says about us as a species that certain kinds of technology have become so ubiquitous that it no longer provokes us, or perhaps provokes us in an avoidant way. When I was in middle school, somewhere around the 6th to 8th grade, we had internet at home for the first time. And that meant that you had to share your phone line with the internet, and that it would ring busy. And if somebody picked up the phone, you'd get this loud electric squeal. So spending long periods of time online was seen as a provocation because it was a threat to people potentially contacting you. Whereas nowadays, nobody seems to want to answer their phone to actually talk. And so we've sort of gone avoidant in the other way. With deepfakes using AI on the phone to impersonate your family members already starting to occur, will technology provoke more people towards distrust, disengagement, or ignoring? You seem to at least approach this question when you speak of the internet and the vast number of voices and the amount of data with which we are flooded. In a world filled with misinformation, deepfakes, and where there is now an app that will allow you to text with an AI that represents Jesus, how do we recognize whether something is authentically a central signal, as you call it, or at least consonant with one? This week I was guest lecturing in the Theology and Ethics Department seminar here at the GT for incoming doctoral students. And a student raised a question that is a direct relevance here. We discussed general issues between Christian theology and science, evolution, cosmology, divine action, for those familiar with the way we do things here at CTNS. And then the conversation shifted to AI. The question that was posed to me was whether generative AI could be a source of divine revelation. At least my initial argument is that in terms of subjective divine action, that yes, it's possible to find meaning, inspiration, motivation through interacting with material created by generative AI. A vigil earlier this term here at the GTU, I was asked to give a prayer about technology, use of technology, those who use it, and those who create it. I couldn't find anything that I liked online that wasn't sort of evangelizing. So I used a couple prompts in ChatGPT and put together a prayer that we actually found to be meaningful. The answer that I continue to wrestle with, and I will pose the question to you as well then, is whether you think there can be objective divine action in terms of revelation through generative AI. I think for now I would say that it depends on whether or not there is sufficient indeterminism in the algorithm of the process. I'm skeptical for now, and I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't feel like I can really get an answer. Perhaps your discussion of smartphones reveals the flip side of the argument I'm making about avoidance. We use smartphones, if I'm reading you correctly, as a way to avoid people, situations, and ideas that we find boring, uncomfortable, or unwanted, in favor of echo chambers, ego stroking, validation, and escapism. This focus on smartphones also highlighted the concern that I had from the very beginning of your paper. Not only are humans provoked by technology, sometimes to the point of indifference, but there are also technologies that are designed to continue to provoke us, capture our attention to the point of addiction. In the book, The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony, social psychologists Ray Van Babel and Dominic Packer estimate that based on the size of our smartphones and the amount of time that we spend doom scrolling, that the length of content that the average person consumes a day is equal to that of the height of the Statue of Liberty, that we scroll through that much information. I'm curious how you reconcile seemingly conflicting research regarding our emotional responses to social media context. On one hand, research says that technological literacy appears to help mediate people's emotional responses to misinformation, things like fake news headlines. And yet on the other side, quote, positive social feedback for outrage expressions increases the likelihood of future outrage expressions, consistent with the principles of reinforcement learning. In addition, users conform their outrage expressions to the expressive norms of their social networks, suggesting norm learning also guides online outrage expressions, end quote. Provocations can motivate us. They can engage us with our emotions, but they can also be overwhelming. At the event that Ted just talked about, there was a former high school teacher that I think raised an interesting question here. Paraphrasing her question using some of your terminology, she said that she benefited from provocation during the Sputnik program, and that the United States suddenly became very interested in the quality of their science educators, paying them to go to school on Sundays or on Saturdays. She was able to earn her master's degree for free. However, when faced with the provocation that AI gives us, she said that she wouldn't even know where to begin if she was in the classroom now. And I believe that this is important because and who's going to provide that kind of education to teachers now, she wonders. And I believe this is important because it cannot just be those with an understanding of technology or those who are interested in technology that can give that response. We need to hear other voices. Another quick anecdote about that. We had doctoral orientation session this year. I was on a panel of faculty trying to give tips and tools to incoming students, but all the faculty were encouraged to attend. Well, a student, of course, asked a question about using generative AI in papers. And I say this in tongue-in-cheek with jest to my colleagues, but I saw every head in the room of the faculty members turn to look to me. And sure, I have opinions, but I can't be the only person here that wants to think about that or talk about that. And after sharing my thoughts, we actually ended up in a passionate debate about citation generators and bibliography. Something I never would have thought we would have gotten emotional about with one of our other panelists. So the other takeaway from the story is that some schools may not have somebody who's interested. So what happens then in those places if there isn't somebody who's engaging in these kinds of issues? Digital technologies, though, allow us to access the work of others in ways not possible before, assuming that it's not behind a publisher's paywall. How many of us, though, have taken something that we've had online and copy and pasted it into our syllabus, a policy, perhaps a position on plagiarism? So we share things in new ways as well. On page 7, the last paragraph in section 2.3, you shift from reflecting on electricity, electronics, computers to love. And I guess I found that shift abrupt, and I would like to hear you say a little more about this. You say that the quote, the fundamental insight is love more than anything else. Science, technology, power, all of it is secondary. But without love, these are merely means to an end. Merely means to our own destruction. I fear this comes across as you're making the same point as a popular mathematical articulation because, as you said, music is also more mathematic than we might think. That all you need is love. As an ethicist, I think you would agree that it's necessary but insufficient. We're still capable of, and indeed often do, harm those that we love. And I believe that you would agree with me on this because the second half of your paper really engages in ethics that I think we can look at through a virtue lens. You talk about the concept of anthropotence, and I really couldn't figure out where to put this, so I'm just going to stick it here. You use a continuous calculation, whereas God rested on the seventh day, but anthropotence is omnipresent and always available. So make of that as what you will. But of course, you also mentioned transhumanism. And elsewhere in your chapter, Transhumanism and Catholic Natural Law, in the edited volume, Religion and Transhumanism, you've written that humans have biological first nature, cultural second nature, and this is because as a species we are underdetermined. We've had these discussions before, but I think your energy calculations and your understanding of anthropotence brings me to press you for an answer here. If our biological nature has remained fairly similar over the length of the time modern humans have existed, and then there's a second nature, our culture, including technology, that has changed the most, then what will it actually take to transition from the human to the post-human? If the humans that put Zeus and Thor to shame now are the same species that first benefited from Prometheus and reveled in creating fire, as Tom Hanks' character in the movie Castaway did, as he grunts and yells, "I have made fire," then what will it be that divides Homo sapiens sapiens from Homo sapiens whatever comes next? At this point, the only thing I can think of is really something like mind uploading that radically changes the way that we exist in the world. But what's really vexing me now is that, does that change our supernatural end? I was talking to Ted with this recently, and I think that ultimately we, post-human species with humans, might have different moral virtues. But how could anything that is capable of responding to God's self-communication have an end other, supernatural end, other than the beatific vision? And so could we have different moral virtues, and yet the same supernatural end and the same theological virtues? To continue this train of thought, I was struck by what you said on page 16. Starting with the familiar refrain of responsibility and power, I just assumed you were going to continue with Hans Jonas there, that if we cannot control ourselves through the pursuit of holiness, then we should not become so powerful that we can put our existence at risk. But then you pivot to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and to say that if we had the self-control, whether to limit our power rationally or to limit our actions morally, then we would use it, but we don't. So I pose the following question to you. Are the only species that are capable of becoming a Kardashev type 1 or more civilization those that are virtuous? It seems that without the cardinal virtues, the kind of self-control you argue for may be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. I think you might resonate with such a sentiment because your argument that we need to get better at making it easier or more efficient to be good rather than evil, and that technology cannot replace holiness, but at its best could potentially contribute to that pursuit. You also state that the provocation of evil is to fight against it and stop it. It is not enough to merely ignore evil. Evil must be actively opposed. though in doing so we must never become evil as we try to oppose it. Returning to the earlier discussion of avoidance, how can people continue to have hope and actively fight against evil? As a species, we are able to do more than we've ever been able to before, but that becomes increasingly daunting for the individual who wonders what they can actually do to make a difference when there's so much momentum, money, and power allied against them. Even worse, individuals are often shamed for not doing more to oppose this cause or that cause, or in terms of creation care, etc. This is a tactic from those in power to obscure the root and cause of things. Of course, little things can add up, and doing them often is for the purpose of cultivating habits and dispositions that help us look towards others as much as it is making a concrete difference. But any real solution is going to require change from the largest corporations and governments in terms of, let's say, pollution. And I think this resonates with the feminist critique of Niebuhr. We talk about Niebuhr and sin, and that Niebuhr identifies pride as sort of the ultimate expression of sin. So the solution to that is, of course, self-sacrificial love. Well, Valerie Sagan has pointed out that that doesn't speak to women's experience, who often experience sin differently in terms of hiding and self-approbation. So if we think in terms of virtue, self-approbation can never be a virtue because it's a deficiency of a healthy sense of self. And so looking towards other virtues that might help us in this fight against evil, I wonder, do you think that we need to, the solution to this to feeling powerless might be to reconsider and reconstruct Aristotle's virtue of magnanimity. And then finally here, in that section, your conversation of justice cuts to the core of the issue about the promise of technology to assist us in reducing or removing bias. However, I don't need to tell you the problems with appeals to fairness and algorithms. You already talked about Compass, and here's an algorithm that's meant to reduce bias in criminal sentencing, and research has found that it was no better than the average person who had no experience with the criminal justice system in terms of trying to be more fair in criminal sentencing. But it's also happening in gerrymandering and hiring algorithms. So I'll skip over some of the details there. But people want to trust these algorithms that we think are more objective, are more rational, and yet are still created by people and trained by data sets that are filled with bias. And so how do we get to that point of promise and belief that we want to? So in this final section here, I empathize with the argument that you're making. Everyone needs connection. Loneliness has become an epidemic, and technology alone will not provide true connection. However, I think in some ways technology has contributed to this problem. I realize that I may get a little controversial here, so I apologize in advance, but not everyone seeks to be in a relationship or has children, but technologies that have allowed for things like gender selection have left a large number of men in China without the opportunity to ever get married. Studies are showing that this is leading to higher rates of aggression, lower self-esteem, higher rates of depression and suicidal thoughts. In the United States, we've seen a rise in violence from those who are identified as incels, involuntary celibates, with technology giving them a chance to share their views and their despair in echo chambers, to feed on these feelings. So as Christians, we're called to love our neighbors, and everyone is our neighbors, but we're incapable of being all things to all people. Beecham and Childers in bioethics sort of say that you can be non-maleficent to everybody. Like I can actively not harm everybody in the room, but I don't necessarily have the resources to actively act beneficently. I can't necessarily help everybody. And psychologically, Dunbar's number tells us that there is a limit to the number of close friends or connections we can have. It's about 150, they say. And even if we are called to love, and we're not perfect though, and sometimes there are people we find unlikable, unlovable. What incels don't seem to understand is that no one is entitled to love and affection from anyone. No one is required to give that to you. Even if the real lack of human connection has physical and mental consequences. So I end with asking you one last set of questions. If humans have a need for connection that no one else is obligated to meet or provide, is turning to a technological solution to mitigate these consequences expected, rational, and perhaps the best we can do? Is the quest for the creation of AGI an extension of the human desire to not be alone? Do we yearn for another species with which to contemplate our existence in the universe? And what might we learn from such interactions about what it means to be human, and perhaps about what God desires for all of creation. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
So, I can stick around closer to you. I'll zoom the camera back in.
Okay. So first of all, you just laid like a zillion issues out. And so, wow, how am I going to respond? So there were a couple questions in there, which were specific questions. Let me see if I understood correctly, because I was writing so quickly, I'm not sure I absorbed all the understanding. You said Kardashev civilizations seem only possible if they're morally good. Is that what you were saying?
Right.
Yeah.
So look at the Fermi paradox, that maybe the reason that we've not seen other civilizations.
Nobody's been good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is possible, I would say, is that if you're going to get to that level, you need to be morally good enough not to destroy yourself. And this also gets into the idea of God being self-existent, right? Which is God's self-existence and God's omnipotence. Those can go together. If you're omnipotent and not self-existent, you're probably going to end up destroying yourself at some point. And combine that, especially if it's combined with not being good at the same time. But one of the things I like about God's attributes is that the all good, self-existent, and omnipotent, those go together pretty well. But if you apply it to humans and say, okay, we're not omnipotent, but we're getting pretty dangerous. We're not all good, and we're also not self-existent. The risks are pretty big there. So I think that could relate to the Fermi paradox. I agree. Which is just the general idea that there's not enough, or there aren't a bunch of aliens around because they end up destroying themselves. I don't think it's 100% likelihood. I think it's a difficult one, but that it's possible to deal with it. Let's see. There's so much more here. Oh yeah. You questioned the all you need is love comment. I know. It's like, darn it, it's sort of apparently quoting the Beatles unconsciously. And so I mean it's a very theological statement, right? If God is love, then maybe all you do need is love. But of course there's a lot more associated with that, because when love, I think it's Dorothy Day who says that real love in practice is a harsh and dreadful thing, or maybe it was someone else who says that, or maybe she's quoting someone else, I can't remember. That and the reason it is because it's very difficult to actually love people. So I think it's just such a very difficult task for humans, especially in groups for some reason. Individuals seem to be able to relate to each other that way. For some reason, particularly between groups, we can't get this love idea to work. Let's see, gosh, so many other things to talk about. Say more about magnanimity as a solution for AI.
Well, the way that I talk about it with my students, because they just don't understand. Right? They look at Aristotle's list of virtues and they're like, what is magnanimity? And I'd say it's about the great soul person. It's knowing that you're capable of what you can do. And I think, to me, that is potentially the only antidote to feeling powerless. In the sense of, against all this power that's out there against me, you have to recognize that you're still capable of something. Okay,
yeah. That's a good one. And I think a lot of it depends on social context, right? Because if you're in North Korea or a country that is extremely oppressive, it would be hard to be confident to have that great soul type of disposition. But I think, of course, one of the good things about a free culture, or free nation at least, is that we always do have a certain amount of power. And you're right, we have to think of ourselves. You have to be ambitious. You have to have, that confidence, or that antidote to powerlessness is fundamentally a psychological stance. Of course, the danger of that turning into hubris is it's right there. And this is actually something that has been talked about with various Silicon Valley folks like Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen, which is that they almost certainly turn their magnanimity into hubris, and they're encouraging others to do the same. But at the same time, I think some of that encouragement to do that is because they're responding to what I'm trying to say. People are perhaps more likely to be deficient in that capacity than they are to exceed it, although maybe that's not the case. We certainly have plenty of narcissists. Yeah, among CEOs, for some reason, there's plenty of hubris. Yeah, so that's one that's definitely worth pondering. And then I do want to open it up to other folks. When you mentioned that love is not an entitlement, but it's a need without a right. So, I mean, it's kind of like the right to food, right? It's a need without, people argue whether there's a right to food, right? But if there's just plain no food around, how can you actually get food to a person? If there just aren't, if you have 120 men for every 100 women or something like that, as some countries in the world are, then you're right, they're pretty much cut off. They don't have an opportunity to have a relationship in that way. And can chatbots help? So this is something that we talked about actually a little bit in one of our Vatican groups, which is that it seems like you don't want to just go replacing people with technology, but under certain circumstances, there is no better replacement. I mean, if there's literally nobody around to talk to or nobody to hang out with, or you mentioned Tom Hanks stuck on an island all by himself, and he takes the ball and names it Wilson, right? I don't know how many people have seen that movie. What was it called? Castaway?
Yeah.
Castaway, yeah. Having a ball named Wilson is probably a better alternative than going crazy if that's the alternative. But at the same time, if you're going to do this with AI, the AI ideally, I think, should be constantly saying, hey, there's maybe a person like you out there you should go find, or here's, why don't you go to this social location and try to meet people. I think there's an opportunity there for it not to become kind of an end in itself, but technology is always a means to something. And if you're in a relationship with the technology, then the relationship with the technology, I think, should ultimately be directing you towards maybe your better opportunities, and I don't know if I want to call it opportunities exactly. Lead you to kind of what's your better end, I guess, would be, and not just have the technology get that end, like the chatbot girlfriend. I mean, I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to use these chatbot boyfriends and girlfriends, and they're going to figure this out on their own, that this is not the way they want to be spending their time. But it would be great if the technology recognized that in the first place.
Well, I think it's there to capitalize.
Oh yeah, it's about money ultimately, which is, I think I gave a statistic yesterday that 2 million people were using the Replica app, and 250,000 of them were paying $70 a year for it, which turns into quite a bit of money. All right, thoughts? Others out there?
You're doing a little bit there, but when you said the AI would tell you go out and meet somebody,
yeah.
I could imagine it in a motherly voice saying, "How are you going to meet someone nice?"
Yeah, you're exactly. And actually, so this gets back to a conversation that I had with my students once, which was that I had a student say, "Look, my smartphone is my mother. It tells me where the best restaurants are. It tells me how to get from one place to another. It tells me how to contact my friends and how to call people. And it does all of these things." And she said that in class, and I'm like, wow, I've never thought about it that way before. But in a certain way, this is what we're doing, is infantilizing ourselves, right? It's this infantilization process where all of a sudden technology has become our parent. And so having AI step into that is almost the most natural thing that could possibly happen with the technology, is that it says, you know what, humans really just want to be babies. And so I'm gonna be your parent, and you can be the baby, because that's all that humans really want to be. that is the totalitarian dystopia where everyone is happy, right? That's the Brave New World. Yeah, Brave New World was written in 1930. That always boggles my mind that it's almost 100 years old now.